Welcome to the debate. Usually when we talk about losing something in life, we expect a certain mechanical precision in getting it back.
Right, a clear step-by-step process.
Exactly. If you drop your keys, you retrace your steps. You lose your wallet, you call the bank, you cancel the cards, and, a few days later, a new piece of plastic arrives in the mail. It's a clean, binary transaction. Lost and then found.
Yeah, and it's comforting. I mean, we as humans desperately want things to be solvable through a checklist. We want a clear procedural fix for our problems.
But then you step into the world of losing your identity, and suddenly that lost and found box is completely empty.
Oh, it's a void.
It is. And I'm not just talking about the inconvenience of a stolen credit card. Whether that fracture of the self happens through the slow, invisible erosion of childhood emotional neglect, or through the sudden catastrophic shock of severe financial fraud or medical identity theft, we are looking at a landscape of the self that is incredibly murky. It is profoundly disorienting.
It's the absolute definition of a shattered reality because you aren't just missing a piece of plastic or a password. The very parameters of who you are in the world, how society views you, how institutions categorize you, your fundamental safety, all of it has been completely compromised.
Yes, exactly. Which brings us to the core of what we are debating today. How does a person actually reclaim their identity after a severe disruption?
It's a massive question.
If you are listening to this and you've ever felt that profound loss of self, you know exactly how daunting this is. I'm looking at the clinical and neurobiological data here, and I will be arguing that true identity restoration is fundamentally an internal, psychological process. It is a neurobiological repair job governed by cognitive and narrative coherence.
And I completely disagree with framing this purely as an inside job. I will contend that identity is a socially constructed reality. If your identity has been fractured, it must be healed externally through systemic remediation and relational validation from the outside world.
Well, let me start by explaining why the fix has to come from the inside. We have to look at the actual mechanisms of how identity forms and how it breaks in the brain.
Okay, lay it out.
When trauma hits, the disruption is deeply cognitive. It's biological. Let's look at the concept of structural dissociation. When a person experiences something completely overwhelming, the brain essentially builds a firewall to survive.
A division of the self to cope with the unbearable.
Precisely. You get what researchers call an apparently normal part of the personality, the part that goes to work, pays the bills, and smiles at the neighbors. But trapped behind that firewall is the emotional part, holding all the terror, the memory, and the fragmentation.
Right, the stuff they can't integrate.
And the mechanism behind this is rooted in the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain's storyteller and integrator. Bessel van Kolk's research documents this beautifully. If you take a child raised in an emotionally neglectful environment, their prefrontal cortex literally does not develop that integrative capacity.
Because it wasn't modeled for them.
Exactly. They don't learn how to synthesize their internal state. Instead, they develop what is essentially a hollow center. Because their internal world is ignored by their caregivers, they learn to prioritize external performance. They become hyper-attuned to what others want. Because, well, that is what keeps them safe. So, if your identity was fractured because you had to abandon your internal self to survive, healing must happen from the inside out. Identity is rebuilt through cognitive restructuring. Relying on external systemic validation to fix you is a trap because your internal observer, the core engine of who you are, is fundamentally offline.
I hear the emphasis on the internal, I do. But we cannot ignore the philosophical and systemic reality of human existence.
What do you mean?
Well, identity is not merely a subjective state of consciousness tucked away inside the dark box of your skull. It is an intersubjective, socially constructed reality. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur teaches us that our identity is performative.
Performative in what sense?
In the sense that it exists in the space between people. We find otherness already inside us in the language we use, our cultural references, our legal standing in society. Therefore, psychological healing is completely impossible if a person's external parameters remain corrupted.
I mean, impossible is a strong word.
But I mean it literally. Look at the severe trauma of identity theft. If you've lived through this Kafkaesque nightmare, you know what I mean. The systemic invalidation, the bureaucratic inertia, the fact that institutional fraud departments actively treat victims with suspicion, all of this actively compounds their trauma.
It adds a layer, sure.
It's more than a layer, it's a blockade. Healing requires forensic action. It requires utilizing statutory tools like Fair Credit Reporting Act blocks, or demanding HIPAA medical record amendments, and securing actual community acknowledgement. As Judith Herman outlines in her framework of truth and repair, survivors need validation and witness. They need justice in the real world. You cannot heal an identity that the outside world is actively, legally denying.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the root of the shame that follows this kind of trauma. Whether we are talking about the profound shame of childhood neglect or the shame experienced by a fraud victim sitting in a bank manager's office, we are fundamentally dealing with a cognitive distortion.
A distortion?
Yes, the brain is making a translation error. The victim is internalizing an external failure and mistaking feelings for facts. They think, bad things are happening to me, therefore I am inherently bad.
I come at it from a different way. The bank is treating them like they are bad.
Yes, they are, but the internalization of that treatment as a reflection of self-worth is the distortion. Cognitive behavioral therapy shows us that this post-traumatic shame is maintained by specific thought traps, like mental filtering or all-or-nothing thinking.
Right, the classic CBT model.
Exactly. If a victim of identity theft feels completely worthless as a human being because their credit score is suddenly 400, that feeling of worthlessness is a cognitive error. We have to use tools to rebuild the internal architecture of the self. This isn't just about feeling better, it's about neuroplasticity.
But you can't neuroplasticity your way out of a lawsuit.
No, but when you use something like a 4-column cognitive restructuring matrix, you are forcing the brain to slow down. You map out the trigger, the automatic negative thought, the objective evidence for and against it, and then generate a balanced thought. Or take the Daily Wins Journal.
Okay, but
Wait, just let me finish this thought. When you force yourself to record 3 small victories a day, you are actively rewiring the brain's evolutionary negativity bias. After 30 days, you have 90 pieces of written evidence countering your inner critic. The healing is entirely dependent on this internal cognitive synthesis. Without it, you are just a passenger to your own panic.
Like I said, I come at it from a different way. I think calling that shame a cognitive distortion is missing the reality of what the victim is facing. That shame is highly rational. It is a completely understandable biological response to social stigma and institutional betrayal.
Understandable, yes, but still a distortion of their inherent worth.
Is it? When someone's identity is stolen, they feel shame because society implicitly blames them. Why didn't you shred your mail? Why did you click that link? The Identity Theft Resource Center notes that victims experience hypervigilance, insomnia, and profound trauma. Why? Because their actual safety in the physical world is gone.
But the physical threat and the psychological identity are two different things.
Are they? I mean, if someone steals your medical identity, alters your health records, and now you can't get life insurance, or they ruin your financial standing so you can't sign a lease for an apartment, you cannot simply CBT your way out of a corrupted credit report.
I'm not saying you CBT the report. I'm saying you CBT the internal reaction.
But the systemic failure itself is the trauma. Telling a victim to sit at home and write in a Daily Wins journal while a bank is holding them legally liable for $50,000 in fraudulent charges is completely dismissing their reality. Their identity in the eyes of the world is ruined, and this shame is a direct byproduct of that external reality. You have to fix the reality to fix the shame.
But wait, let me push back on this. If we just focus on fixing the credit report or amending the medical record, we are essentially trying to update the GPS software on a car that has a blown transmission.
How so?
Well, the map might show you exactly where you need to go. The external reality might be perfectly aligned, but you don't have the engine to get there. Yes, the external systems absolutely matter. But if the individual's metacognition is offline, if they have lost the ability to reflect upon, monitor, and synthesize their own thoughts and emotions, they cannot integrate those external legal victories into their sense of self.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
We see this all the time in driven, high-performing individuals who have experienced developmental trauma. They might have a perfect 800 credit score, an impeccable resume, and absolute systemic validation from society. Yet they still suffer from profound identity fragmentation. They have the outer architecture of a self, but they are hollow inside.
Because they haven't achieved external justice for their specific trauma.
No, because they lack internal narrative coherence. That is why James Pennebaker's expressive writing protocol is so vital in trauma recovery. It's not just a diary. By forcing oneself to recount, structure, and re-narratize a traumatic experience on paper, you actively engage the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, engaging the cortex, sure.
And this does something very specific. It signals to the amygdala that the threat is in the past. It regulates the HPA axis, the body's alarm system, dropping cortisol levels and stopping the obsessive rumination that keeps the trauma active. The story we tell ourselves is what literally constructs our sense of self. The narrative coherence has to come first, otherwise external validation just bounces off.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Why not?
Let me tell you why. Relying solely on internal narrative is incredibly fragile. Ricoeur warns us that our narratives are partly in the hands of others, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. Identity isn't just an internal, privately authored story. It is intrinsically tied to our physical, external manifestations, our actions, and how society reacts to those actions. Think about the Afanina case from the clinical material.
Ah, the traumatic brain injury case.
Exactly. This is a striking example of how external disruption dictates identity. Here was an individual who suffered a traumatic brain injury. That physical, external event radically altered her character traits.
Right, she developed extreme disinhibition.
Yes, a personality disorder characterized by extreme disinhibition, mood swings, and cognitive fatigue. Because of this, she couldn't hold down her normal corporate job. Facing financial ruin, she eventually turned to sex work as a dominatrix to survive. Now, her identity was profoundly altered, but not because she wrote a bad internal narrative or had a cognitive distortion. It changed because a physical disruption changed how she interacted with the world, and crucially, how the world interacted with her.
But that's a structural brain injury. That's slightly different than...
It's the ultimate proof that identity is not a ghost in the machine. It is deeply situated in our physical capacity and our systemic reality. When an external force, be it a brain injury or a catastrophic financial fraud that strips you of your assets, alters your parameters, your identity changes. A new feedback loop with society is created. You can't just journal your way out of that reality. You have to navigate the world as it treats you.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I'm certainly not denying the impact of external forces or societal feedback loops, but I am arguing about the sequence of healing. If your healing is entirely dependent on how external systems validate you, you remain a victim to those systems.
How is fighting back remaining a victim?
Because you are handing your power back to the very structures that traumatized you. This is why behavioral activation and progressive discomfort challenges must originate from an internal commitment first.
But how does a victim find that commitment if they are actively being crushed by the system?
By building the internal muscle first. Consider the DESC technique for self-assertion. It stands for describe the situation, express your feelings, specify what you want, and conclude with the benefits. A person has to build the internal capacity to tolerate the immense discomfort of setting a boundary before they can actually execute it in the real world.
But the threat is immediate.
Right, but if you lack self-esteem, if your internal observer is offline and you are flooded with panic, you will avoid the very actions needed to reclaim your identity. Avoidance feels like relief in the short term, but it locks the trauma in place permanently. You have to bring the internal observer back online first. Only then can a person successfully sit on the phone with a fraud department and advocate for their legal rights. The agency has to precede the advocacy.
I strongly disagree with that sequence. You are asking a victim whose agency has just been shattered to somehow bootstrap their way into internal coherence before the threat is even removed.
It's not bootstrapping, it's stabilization.
The sequence must prioritize external safety and relational justice because trauma inherently destroys internal agency. Judith Herman's work fundamentally challenges this bootstrapping idea. She argues that survivors need acknowledgement, validation, and community witness above all else. Justice is the healing,
But justice isn't guaranteed.
which is exactly why the fight for it is so psychologically necessary. Think about the forensic advocacy required in severe identity disruption. If there is fraudulent, highly damaging data in a person's medical file, the HIPAA privacy rule grants them the legal right to request an amendment to their designated record set. The hospital has 60 days to act.
And if they deny it?
If they deny it, the victim has the right to submit a formal statement of disagreement that legally must accompany all future disclosures of that medical record. That act, the active forensic defense of one's factual innocence, is the very thing that restores a victim's autonomy. It proves to the victim that their reality matters and is enforceable in the physical world. You don't need perfect internal coherence to demand your legal rights.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are assuming the individual can withstand the process. What happens when those 60 days pass, the medical entity denies the amendment, or a major credit bureau outright refuses to remove the fraudulent account despite a legally mandated FCRA block? We know this happens constantly.
It's devastating, yes.
It is a secondary trauma. This is exactly what we see in the clinical literature regarding institutional betrayal. The bureaucratic inertia compounds the original wound. If the victim hasn't done the internal work, if they haven't used something like the downward arrow technique to identify their core beliefs, to deeply recognize that an institutional failure does not mean they are inherently worthless, they will collapse. The internal cognitive structure absolutely must be robust enough to withstand the inevitable failures and gaslighting of the external forensic process.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that the failure of the institution is exactly why the external fight is so crucial to identity reclamation?
Go on.
When an institution fails the victim, it reinforces the exact dynamic of neglect or perceived betrayal that caused the initial trauma. Yes, it is exhausting. Yes, the victim might face a soul-crushing maze trying to clear their name. But conceding the external reality to the fraudster or to the negligent hospital is a permanent capitulation of identity.
I wouldn't call it capitulation. It's self-preservation in some cases.
I disagree. By utilizing statutory protections, filing disputes, and forcing the system to acknowledge the truth, the individual is reclaiming their space in the social fabric. Even if it is a brutal fight, the fight itself is the reclamation. It is the individual moving from being a passive object of someone else's deception to an active subject in the social order. As Riker notes, the truth of the self is an intrasubjective event. It is forged in the world with others in the realm of action.
I completely agree that action in the world is necessary, but I maintain that the capacity for that sustained action requires a cohesive self-narrative to fuel it. Let's look at the physiological mechanism of trauma one more time.
Okay.
Chronic stress, like the kind caused by a lingering identity theft case or decades of unresolved childhood neglect, produces sustained, relentless activation of the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. This means your brain is pumping out chronic cortisol. It literally suppresses your immune function and keeps the brain in a constant state of hyperarousal. You cannot effectively fight a credit bureau or logically debate a medical billing department when your brain is perceiving a mortal threat, like a tiger in the room.
Which is precisely why the tiger needs to be removed.
But you can't always remove it instantly. The cognitive work, whether through integrative CBT, expressive writing, or deliberately developing self-compassion, serves to artificially down-regulate that physiological panic so you can function. It allows the individual to step back from their racing thoughts, to observe them without fusing with them. Once you create that internal space, the external actions become strategic rather than frantic and reactive.
I don't disagree that physiological regulation is incredibly helpful, but I think you are vastly underestimating how much of that physiological regulation comes directly from external security.
Really? Directly from it?
Yes. When an individual finally gets a physical letter stating their factual innocence has been proven, or when a fraud alert successfully stops a criminal from opening a new account in their name, the HPA axis downregulates precisely because the external environment is objectively safer. The tiger has been caged.
Well, sure, if you get that win.
Exactly. And the Identity Theft Resource Center treats this comprehensively through a trauma-informed lens. They recognize that recovery isn't just about fixing a mindset. It's about restoring dignity, choice, and control in the real world. Validation from the outside, hearing someone with authority say, "You are targeted, this is not your fault, and we are legally fixing the record," is a profound catalyst for neurological regulation. The external validation jumpstarts the internal hearing.
It seems we are approaching a really profound realization here as we wrap up our discussion. My stance remains that the reclamation of identity is fundamentally rooted in internal cognitive and narrative synthesis. Without an internal observer, without the capacity to formulate a cohesive, regulated story of the self, all the external remediation in the world will just bounce off a hollow center. You have to rebuild the neurobiological and cognitive architecture to truly know who you are, especially when the world is failing you.
And I maintain the absolute necessity of external systemic remediation and relational witness. Identity is not built in a vacuum, and it cannot be repaired in one. It is a social reality. When it is corrupted by external violations, it must be restored through active forensic advocacy, demanding your legal rights and securing community acknowledgement. You simply cannot heal an identity in isolation while the world continues to hold a fraudulent version of you on record.
But what is becoming abundantly clear through our exchange today is that the reclamation of identity is ultimately a complex, dual-track process. Internal narrative healing and active forensic advocacy are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are intimately connected, and likely both are entirely necessary to survive a fractured identity.
I completely agree with that. You absolutely need the internal resilience to sustain the exhaustion of the external fight. And conversely, you need that external systemic victory to ultimately validate and anchor your internal reality. Viewing identity through both a clinical psychological lens and a metaphysical forensic lens gives us a much richer, more accurate understanding of what it means to be a person existing in society.
Absolutely. There is so much more to explore in this material regarding how legal systems, bureaucratic institutions, and mental health frameworks can better intersect to provide trauma-informed care for victims. Because at the end of the day, when you look into that empty, lost and found box of your own identity, you realize you can't just wait for a bank or an institution to hand it back to you. You have to build the internal strength to demand it and master the external tools to retrieve it. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.